The arcade. Whilst the concept of amusements has been around in one form or another for a lot longer than even the oldest person currently alive, if you mention arcades to most people, rather than thinking of skee ball, lever-operated fruit machines and mechanised horse races, your old 1920s promenade style, most people's minds will instead go to the smoky, neon-lit paradise of the coin-operated video game. Yet crazily enough, the arcade, whilst undergoing a bit of a niche comeback these days in the form of adult barcades, etc., was only really around for a very small window of time. Birthed in the 70s with the likes of Pong and Pac-Man, pretty much closed in the 2000s. The boom was really in the 80s and 90s, before home tech was advanced and affordable enough that a trip to play the latest and greatest really became an irrelevance. However, whilst it may not have burned for long, it sure did burn bright. And the zenith of arcade games saw so many classics born that in attempting a top 10 list of arcade favourites, I couldn't even try without having to put a bunch of limiters on myself to stop from going ham. Only one entry per franchise, only 1 or 2 entries per genre. It was hard, and I still haven't narrowed it down. But you know what it did remind me? Was just how many happy hours back then were spent under the thrall of that sensory paradise. When I realised I had enough entries to do genre-specific lists, hey, who am I to say no? So, let's get started on this arcade series, which arguably you could say we've already started given that my fighting game and Sega arcade classics covers pretty much my favourite fighting and racing games. But enough about those, let's get on with today's topic, the light gun game. Okay, so maybe light gun is a bit of a misnomer, as some of the oldest entries were just machine-mounted guns that essentially were acting on top of a joystick. But let's not quibble here. The fact is that they were all gun games, and the evolution of them was a real joy to behold. When you see how we start to the way we end the list, it's incredible just to see the range of entries we have here. So let's dive right in. But first off, before we get started on the actual list, we got to make some honourable mentions that didn't quite make the cut. So apologies to any fans of Lethal Enforcers. It did kind of lead the way for a little while there with its digitised sprites and playing the whole Dirty Harry cop with a magnum to dole out justice the American way. But I'm afraid there are just a few more qualified entries out there. Similarly, Zombie Raid, super fun game, really good. And Crypt Killer, also really underrated, and both are really worth a play if you ever come across one in the wild, or if you want to emulate them. If you can get your hands on it, worth doing. But unfortunately they just failed to make the grade. And same with Jurassic Park. It was okay, but it just didn't quite have the same feeling as the rest of this list to be deemed worthy. Now, without further ado, on to the top 10. Okay, so this first entry may seem like a bit of a cheat, placing 3 games in one entry, but the truth is that even between all 3 titles, I barely played enough of any of them alone to warrant one specific title earning its place above the other 2. But between all 3 of them, yeah, they certainly do earn their place in the top 10. Okay, so the arcade scene was pretty much all but over, certainly at least in the UK, by the time Armageddon arrived. We did still have places like bowling alleys that still had a pretty good selection of machines. Well, I say good selection, it was mostly this, Mario Kart, basketball and some fruit machines, but it was still there in spirit. The arcade lived on in its very limited form. And it was still a welcome blast of Xeno hunting nostalgia to get the adrenaline pumping. Yeah, sure, Alien 3 was a bit more of a rare find back in those days, but that's more sort of a subjective view because I didn't really get the chance to go to bigger cities that often to see their wider selection. And of course, the Alien home game was pretty different. It was more of a run and gun and finding survivors kind of deal, so completely different. Alien Extinction didn't get so much to play, only tried it like a few times in more recent times, but again, definitely worth a shout. And so between the 3 of them, they earn their place in the top 10, just squeaking in. Okay, this is the game that started it all, right? Well, technically no, as there have always been shooting galleries in one form or another, but in terms of the video game, this is the forerunner that pops into most gamers' heads from back in the 80s. Sure, it may not look amazing by today's standards, but given the fact that most games back then were incredibly simplistic, this actually really stood out. And the fact that back then you had to use an actual gun, he says in air quotes, rather than a simplistic, joystick one button combo was huge. And a real eye catcher back then, it certainly grabbed everyone's attentions when you walked into an arcade. And it definitely set the bar for all the other entries on this list. Yes, it was pretty much a Rambo-inspired forerunner to, everything else that's come since. But it was fun. It was a really nice, like, simple rail shooter from left to right or right to left, depending on how the level went. And whilst it definitely ate the quarters, it definitely gave some value for money. And therefore, surely on pedigree alone, it is worthy inclusion into the list. Okay, we're jumping forward to the turn of the decade we all want to return to, the 1990s, which saw the futuristic concept of using live video action. And that's to bring the classic Western to life in the arcades, with American laser games bringing their knowledge of, surprisingly enough, making police training simulators to the mainstream market with its gun-slinging slice of frontier Americana. Yep, it's Mad Dog McCree. This game always stuck in my head. Okay, so it may not have been the most fast-paced, frantic of shooters, but the visuals, especially for the time when the only even close to digitized game around pretty much was Pit Fighter, and even that was on like pixelated backgrounds. This was something else. A classic six-gun shooter controller, and the feeling in being in one of those classic stunt shows that you used to see at shows all the time. There was just a flair in this game that most other games just couldn't mimic back in the beginning of the 90s. The ultimate sign of its enduring appeal is that there's now, ironically, a band called Mad Dog McCree. I have no idea if they're any good. I just happened to discover that whilst researching for the video, and if that's not a good sign 34 years later on, then I'm not sure what is. So yeah, number 8 we are definitely giving to Mad Dog McCree. If there was ever a game that screamed 90s attitude in excess, heavy emphasis on the X in there, it's got to be Midway's entry into the list, the eponymous Revolution X. Okay, this Gen X wet dream had it all. Over the top violence? Check. Bikini babes? In the form of Mortal Kombat's very own Sonya Blade, Kerry Hoskins, who got to work with Midway again, playing not only the scantily clad damsels, but also the Mistress Helga. Check. Rocking soundtrack? Wow. I mean, literally featured Aerosmith in the game, so yep, check. And it even featured CDs as projectiles. So, of course, in true bombastic style, the excess was only tempered by the difficulty. Oh boy. Revolution X was fun, it was loud, it was in your face, it was everything all those advertising, marketing, slogan people would love to throw at you. But it was incredibly difficult. And even in like single player mode, just forget about it because it was just too difficult. In multiplayer, it was somewhat easier, but the crazy bosses would just eat through your lives and credits faster than the kidnapped band you were trying to save, Aerosmith, could run through a tour bus of groupies, allegedly. But yeah, this game was amazing fun. Like I say, in single player, it was good, but it really came into its own in multiplayer. If you're playing with a friend, blasting through, having a whale of a time, getting to choose where you go, trying to save the band, find all the secrets. Ah, This was definitely a worthy inclusion, has to be on the list. Some people would argue it should be higher, but yeah, even if the home conversions failed to live up to the arcade excellence, the arcade version was definitely excellence itself. So, yep, there we go. Revolution X is our number 7. Any arcade list wouldn't be complete without a transition from pixels to full motion video to polygons. And the polygon era hit the light gun in some style, with Sega hitting it big out the blocks against its arcade rival Namco. Yep, number 6, just missing out on the top 5, is Virtua Cop. Similar to its Daytona USA game, Virtua Cop came with 3 progressive difficulty levels. I guess similar to Virtua Racing as well, now that I think about it. But whilst it's a short entry, it certainly packed a lot into those 3 levels. And it had a very dynamic and interesting take on the shooter genre. It had this lock-on mechanic with this huge oversized reticle highlighting the enemy that needed shooting. But every time you managed to hit an enemy, it was a very satisfying connection. Every time you shot them, you could actually choose to target body parts and even just disarm combatants, which was completely different to everything we'd seen before. Whereas before, you shoot at the screen and no matter where you hit the enemy, they always were like, clutch their chest and fall to the floor or whatever. This time you could actually choose which body part to hit. Amazing. Sega's AM2 engine was in full flow here, and we're really talking about the heights of Sega. Sure, at the home market, they might have been completely clueless and not really knowing what they were doing between the 32X and the Saturn, but in the arcades, they were smashing it. And whilst the series went on to garner success with its sequels, and arguably, Virtua Cop 2, probably the most well regarded in the series. The first one has got to take the spot, purely being the first and being one of the biggest earners in Japan in '95, and being in one of the top 10 spots in the USA. Given the height of the arcade boom at the time, and considering the titles that were out there, that is no mean feat. And of course, let's not forget the biggest influence that Virtua Cop had on the gaming world would actually be its direct influence on the creation of GoldenEye for the Nintendo 64. If that doesn't get you into this top 10, I don't know what will. And so we're here, into the top 5. And of course, Sega's arch nemesis, the giant N. No, not Nintendo. In the arcade, it's the other N. Namco. Namco weren't about to let Sega gain all the plaudits, and they were hot on the heels of Virtua Cop with their own polygonal shooter, Time Crisis. This gun game had so much more exciting features though. It has to pip Sega and get into the top 5. Okay, where do you want to start? The dedicated foot pedal for ducking? The strict time limit? Being able to hit enemies multiple times in a very satisfying combo style? Oh, that's not enough for you? How about all the stage hazards that you had to use the foot pedal to avoid? It really did set the bar a lot higher than, I believe it came out around the same time as Virtua Cop 2. So it did feel leaps and bounds ahead of where Sega were. And indeed, future entries into the series would really develop it as one of the greatest of all times in arcade shooters. Both entries have a very substantial and engaging feel to them, and both deserve to stand proud of their places. But given the fact that Time Crisis just felt better, and of course we can't go without mentioning the guns that they actually used, those guns were awesome. But maybe we'll talk about Namco's guns in a future entry. So number 5, Time Crisis. And we're carrying on. We had pretty much a bit of a spoiler in the last one. But yeah, at number 4, Namco were indeed quite the thorn in Sega's plans for arcade dominance. Well, at least in the racing and light gun game departments at the very least. But not all of the shooting games have to be super serious crime and violence fests. Not everything has to be Reservoir Dogs meets a Polygon. No. Therefore, enter Point Blank. Point Blank. So much fun. Very much the carnival attraction kind of side of light gun games, harkening back to those older days of gun shooters that really just don't see much these days anymore. It was over the top. The characters were absolutely insane, like some Japanese game show. The challenges were incredibly bizarre and diverse and super fun. The graphics were bright and colourful and loud. The guns themselves, yes, we're going back to those Namco guns, but this time they were bright pink and blue. And that realistic recoil function, well, I say realistic, being a Brit, I have limited, knowledge of actual real guns, but hey, don't hold that against us. We prefer knives. No, I'm joking. But yeah, that just felt so satisfying. They were so enjoyable to use them. When you stood there blasting away with your friends, it was amazing time. And yeah, this one definitely was one to spend with your friends. Whilst the other entries, you could say, yep, multiplayer is fun, but you could actually get a lot of mileage out of them in single player. This one, Point Blank, was definitely built around the cooperative experience. This was definitely one to be enjoyed with friends. In fact, you could almost say it was like a Nintendo-style entry. Yeah, sure, it was in the gun section, but it was doing something very different and eccentric from what everyone else was doing, while still keeping huge overall appeal, and that came with massive success. The home version was also great fun, and it definitely helped that it managed to sell it with the light gun, and with Point Blank and then Time Crisis coming on the PlayStation, yeah, that definitely gave Namco the edge. Sorry Sega, but Point Blank takes number 4 spot. Okay, so we're right on into the top 3. And yes, I may have lied to you. Midway are back in it. I can imagine a fair few of you probably guessed what is what in the podium places, even if the arrangement may be a bit of a surprise. But come on, we couldn't have a top 3 without one of the most successful cabinets of the early 90s. One of the very few that ever managed to display Street Fighter 2 from the top spot. Yeah, of course we're talking Terminator 2. If the image of a T800 stood next to a cabinet holding one of the mounted Uzi 9mm doesn't pop into your head at the very mention of this, well, honestly, I'm kind of impressed and shocked that you made it this far into the video. This game was everything that you could want from a shooter. It was amazing, and it was everything you could want from a Terminator game. We've got sound bites from the actual cast. Then we've got the frenetic pace of the action. We're talking huge, quality detailed sprites that were on the screen, especially considering for the time. We had like awesome weapons, we had power-ups. This had everything. This was definitely one of Midway's best. And if I had to pick one gripe, I could say that the sound, not the sound effects. The sound effects were awesome, like I was saying, with the the voice clips, etc. But the actual sound of the game, the music, was pretty much, very similar to Mortal Kombat. So you can definitely see that it was the Midway style of the time. The sound effects just overpowered it anyway, to be honest. So you didn't really notice it, and it definitely wasn't distracting. It's only sort of now more so, not in an arcade, when you're sitting back and researching and looking back at it, that you actually notice it more. Okay, but that's enough of the one quibble. We got to allow it, some sort of wiggle room here. And this game definitely earned it in every other aspect. It was notoriously difficult, with escort missions forcing you to do more than just mindlessly blasting everything away on the screen. You actually had to like keep your wits about you in order to keep people alive. Oh man, that was really, really tough. And like, seeing John Connor get killed when you're almost at the end of the level and you're like, yes, I've done it. And then nope. Yeah, that was heartbreaking, but it was so much fun. Uh, and this game was just everywhere as well. If you walked into an arcade in the early 90s, apart from hearing the huge roar of the elephants from Dhalsim's stage in Street Fighter 2, you would definitely be hearing the sound of T800. And you know what? If it hadn't have been for the fact that it would have completely broken the fourth wall way before Deadpool was on the scene in cinemas, I'm sure John Connor would have happily swapped out Afterburner for this game in the Galleria. The number 3 is Terminator 2. Okay, you didn't really think Sega weren't making it back into the top 2, did you? Now, I'm sure straight away some of you are going to be like, wait a minute, Sega at number 2? What the hell is at number 1? Well, in all honesty, the top 2 could have swapped places if it wasn't for the sheer volume of hours I poured into the number 1 entry. So, this is my list. I get to choose. I have the final say. And yeah, unfortunately, the almighty House of the Dead series has to settle for the runners-up spot. But hey, do you know what, Sega? 1, you're used to the runners-up spot. And 2, hey, at least you beat Namco, so you should be proud of yourselves. Okay, so what more needs to be said about House of the Dead that hasn't already been said by countless others, probably most of you watching, at some point in time? It's one of, if not the greatest light gun game, pretty much to most people. It is literally everything you could want from a light gun game. House of the Dead is a wonderfully camp B-movie romp, and it mixes classic horror with contemporary pop culture hits of the day. We're talking the likes of X-Files and Resident Evil being thrown in with classic old school Universal horror and the 1960s Hammer horror. So I don't know what more anyone could possibly ask for. You've got memorable characters like the mad scientist Dr. Curian in the first entry, or later on in the series, Goldman, the tycoon mastermind who was, behind the Dr. Curian and repeatedly shows up as the main antagonist. We've got a bunch of heroes who, through either themselves or their offspring, when the daughters come in from the original team. G's daughter is in 3 or 4. It's an amazing cast of characters, and yeah, Sega's AM1 dev team really just went off. They absolutely cooked, I believe is the expression these days, when making this game. They pushed the AM2 arcade board to its absolute limits with House of the Dead. Oda-san directing this as a loving homage to so many horror tropes. We've got huge, large sprites filling the screen, but they were really detailed as well, with gore and viscera all over the place, as enemies attack you from all angles. So, you've got different patterns you have to, bear in mind. You can't just blast away. You've got to really sort of go through the game a few times to memorize all the different attack patterns in order to get through the waves. We've got pickups, we've got civilians that we need to actually rescue, and it's not just a case of not shooting them. Some of them you actually have to, get to in time and shoot the monsters that are trying to attack them in order to replenish your health and in order to get a necessary good or bad ending. Because yeah, we have different endings with House of the Dead series as well. So there is definitely replayability there. Always a huge plus in any arcade game. Obviously, most games would just jack up the difficulty, and I'm not saying that House of the Dead was easy. Again, it's one of those ones best played with a friend, but the fact that you can get different endings meant that, you pretty much could see something different each time. And that was definitely a huge plus for the game at the time. You've got a wonderful gothic mansion setting in House of the Dead 1 that really felt like you were playing Resident Evil. It felt you were in the shoes of Chris Redfield or Jill Valentine, running around the mansion, shooting zombies and all sorts of other different wonderful monsters. The sounds both set the ambience and or startled you accordingly, which was due to the great work of Tetsuya Kawauchi. And I think it's in no small part due to the success of House of the Dead and the aforementioned Resident Evil that most media will point to Japan actually being the catalyst for the boom of the zombie franchise of the last, 2.5 decades and counting? Yeah, this was everything. This was amazing. And like I say, if it wasn't for a personal bias, purely because of the memories that I made playing the next entry, this would definitely be number one, and I know it is to most people's eyes. It was lauded critically and commercially, and yeah, this is the heavyweight of the genre. So maybe more a sort of a 1B as opposed to a number 2 entry. But yeah, House of the Dead, absolutely amazing. Couldn't recommend it highly enough. And in fact, why not go and grab yourself the remake, which is on all major platforms now? It's the shorter one of the series, but I do believe that they are actually starting work on House of the Dead 2 remake. So it would be nice if they actually put it all together as a bundle with all of the entries in there. So we shall have to wait and see. Okay, so this is it, our number 1 entry. And boy, I'd love to know how many of you actually managed to get this one. So we've had our top 10, we've had our honourable mentions, and yeah, so now it's number 1. And of all people, it's Atari. Yep, that's right, it's Area 51. And I loved Area 51. I'm sure Atari did too, considering how badly they were doing at the time and how desperately they needed a big hit, whilst trying to stave off EA poaching almost all of their staff. But yeah, Area 51 was amazing. It originally started off as a different game, Bounty Hunter, and then got turned into this, and it was definitely the right call. In the 90s, this was definitely everything that was really popular. So we had a simple premise, alien invasion, government black sites, all of the good stuff that we lapped up in pop culture, from the X-Files, Independence Day, it was all thrown in there. We've got a mixture of digitized humans and some stop-motion creatures. But it wasn't just that. Area 1 had a surprising amount of depth to it, not just in the levels, but in the amount of secrets. In fact, I distinctly remember me and my friends put a huge amount of time and credits into finding every single breakable item on every level that led to all the different secret rooms in the game. Sadly, I know we're watching this footage, which is based off the PS1 version. I don't have the reflexes anymore for pulling off that kind of level of intensity. But back in the day, back in the 90s, yeah, shout out to my college friends, Lee and Leslie, because, yeah, between the three of us, we went through every single level in minute detail to explore each and every last breakable object, shooting everything in order to get the most out of our pocket money. Okay, the music wasn't necessarily as loud as some of the more bombastic titles, especially when you've got this only 2 or 3 cabinets down from the likes of a Revolution X. But the sound effects were weighty, and the hit confirms felt really satisfying, especially with all the breakables. I gotta be honest, if my local arcade had gotten House of the Dead before this, then maybe the entries would have been reversed. I gotta say, replayability again played a huge factor in this, and the fact that when you finished it, the game started again, that was a huge bonus. I think a lot of games could have stood from doing that rather than just being like, oh, game over, you gotta put more money in. But the fact that you could go again, and it was harder, that had to be a huge plus for us. Like I say, the sprites looked amazing, full scale, really nicely detailed. Looking back now, sure, the digitized aspect kind of hasn't aged well, but at the time, it looked amazing, especially compared to what you were playing at home. So for me, this has to take the number one spot. The Alien craze, much like the arcade craze, yeah, both really a thing of the time, but everything just really coalesced to be the right time at the right moment, and shockingly for Atari, it's enough for it to make it my top light gun game. So yeah, let me know what you guys think in the comments. Let me know what makes your list. What are your entries? Do we share any the same? Have you got similar or different orders? Let me know down below. I'll catch you in the next one.
We await your return, warrior.